Books, they're not just commodities. The profit motive is often in conflict with the aims of art. We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art, and very often in our art, the art of words.
That was a short clip from Ursula K. Le Guin's 2014 National Book Award acceptance speech. She began that talk with a warning about impending hard times in a world that would require visionary writers to assist us with developing new perspectives. She began the talk by saying, "Hard times are coming, when we'll be wanting the voices of writers who can see alternatives to how we live now, can see through our fear-stricken society and its obsessive technologies to other ways of being, and even imagine real grounds for hope. We'll need writers who can remember freedom, poets, visionaries, realists of a larger reality." I'm Joseph Orozco, the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures. Our guest on this episode of Conversations on Anarres is Susan DeFreitas. Susan DeFreitas is someone who has taken up Le Guin's challenge in her own work. Susan DeFreitas' fiction, nonfiction, and poetry have been featured in the Writer's Chronicle, the Huffington Post, the Utne Reader, Story Magazine, Daily Science Fiction, Portland Monthly, and High Desert Journal, along with many other journals and anthologies. Her first novel, Hot Season, takes on issues of radical environmental activism and hope. It won a Golden Ippy Award for Best Regional Fiction from the Mountain West in 2017. But most recently, she is the editor of Dispatches from Anarres, an anthology of short fiction in tribute to Ursula K. Le Guin. While she was working on this collection, Susan DeFreitas spent a year reading all of Ursula K. Le Guin's novels. So we decided to sit down with her to see what lessons she learned from this project about how to envision radical alternatives and how to imagine real grounds for hope. So let's turn now to our conversation with Susan DeFreitas.
All right, everyone. Here we are back together on Conversations on Anarres. My special guest today is Susan DeFreitas. I'm here to speak with her about her new collection, Dispatches from Anarres, Tales in Tribute to Ursula K. Le Guin. Susan, thank you very much for being here today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
No, I was just telling you before we started recording that I picked up the book, I think as soon as it hit the stores out at Powell's in Portland, and I've really enjoyed this. And so I wanted to thank you, on air just for the work that you've done and the authors that you were able to collect for this. This is a really fascinating collection, and I think it does really well in honoring the spirit of Ursula. So I'm looking forward to talking with you about this.
All right. Well, I'm so glad you feel that way about it. It's definitely a labor of love.
Well, let's talk a little bit before we get into talking about Dispatches from Anarres in particular. I wanted to ask you, are you a fan of speculative fiction in general?
Absolutely. Yes.
How did you come to speculative fiction? How did you become a fan? And I guess part of this is a question that I always ask people who are authors who we interview is, how did you become a fan, and what were the authors or the movies or the television shows that drew you to this particular genre? Are there particular products that drew you in or that you enjoy?
Yeah, I think that's such a fabulous question because to answer it, I really have to think back quite far in my life. How did this love affair begin? I think it really probably started with A Wrinkle in Time and the works of Madeleine L'Engle. which I believe is probably true for a lot of people. There are certain series that created such strong emotions in us as children that we became speculative fans for life. I know a lot of people feel that way about the works of C.S. Lewis or Tolkien. For me, it was absolutely Madeleine L'Engle's works. But and this is sort of a fun fact that I've been sharing in the course of interviews that I've done for Dispatches from Anarres, which is that my folks, I grew up in the 80s. And at this time, there was this sort of book of the month club that you could be a part of. And they drew you in with, you could get like 20 titles for a penny a piece, right? They had the same thing for albums, for cassettes. But then thereafter, they would send you a new title every month. And to avoid paying full price for it, you had to actually take the time to send it back, which of course, is a pain in the butt. So nobody wanted to do that. The result of which was that my folks had an entire shelf of fantasy and science fiction. And it was through this shelf that I met many of my favorite authors, as I grew older, as I became more of a tween. I read authors like Jane Yolen, Anne McCaffrey, Stephen R. Donaldson, Ray Bradbury, those types of folks, but absolutely the works of Ursula K. Le Guin as well. And I'd always sort of assumed that these Earthsea novels, like all the other books on that shelf, had been the product of the Book of the Month Club. But I found out later, much later, in fact, that my mother had actually read those books while she was pregnant with me. So, you could say that my relationship with Le Guin goes back even that far, right, in utero. But then, I was thinking forward, well, how did this relationship with speculative fiction develop in my life? It developed out of that, when I began picking my own books, when I began buying books myself. My mother would take me to a bookstore called Readmore in Ludington, Michigan, and allow me to pick out one book every time we went. And I, being a kid, chose based on their covers. And as we know, fantasy and sci-fi novels have the best covers. And so that's how I started reading the work of, I believe Mercedes Lackey was really a writer who meant a lot to me as, between the ages of 9 and 12, maybe. But then later, my mother and I read the works of Sherry S. Tepper together when I was in high school. And I wish that her name were more widely known and spoken about, especially in leftist thought, in leftist speculative circles, because she strikes me as one of these great minds, these great women who Le Guin warned us, it doesn't matter how many books you sell or how many awards you win, your name will be erased, systematically erased. Or at least there will be forces that attempt to do that, some actively, some just passively, But I want to really give a shout out to Sherry Tepper for anybody who's interested in feminist thought, anybody who is interested in eco fiction, a speculative fiction that deals with ecological themes. Her book, The Gate to Women's Country, was a big one for me. And then her Arbai series, which is the novels Grass, Raising the Stones, and Sideshow, which ask very important questions about ethics, about the ethics of terraforming, changing a planet to exclusively cater to the needs of Homo sapiens, questions about diversity, what are the ethical quandaries of everybody being allowed to do their own thing, their own culture, their own mores, to an extreme, uh and what might the will of a planet itself as a collective intelligent being, what might that be and how might that manifest? I feel like these are really important questions that these books of hers, that trilogy, asks.
So, thank you for the recommendations. Some of these are I wasn't familiar with that author's work. So many of these things you were reading very young and then continued into a young adult. Um, how did you decide that this was a genre that you wanted to continue working in yourself as an author? Why was this something that you decided was important enough that you wanted to continue immersing yourself in it and also contributing to it as a genre?
In my work as an author, I've really only dabbled in speculative work thus far. I have grand plans, but the fact is, I have an MFA. I started studying creative writing in high school. I went to a boarding school for the arts, and that swayed my interest in the direction of literary fiction. And it was only when I got hired essentially in the midst of grad school by an editing agency based in Portland that I really turned back to speculative fiction as an adult. Um, and it was part of my relationship there, part of what got me back into that world was that this was a genre that I had always loved. And this was a genre where a lot of people were writing in it and they were needing help with it. This is a firm of independent editors. So we were the type of folks that authors who wanted to improve their work, to polish it and shape it before sending it out for consideration by traditional publishers, they would work with us first. And so, working with authors on their speculative fiction projects became my bread and butter, for the better part of my time there. And to this day, it remains a big focus of my practice as a book coach and a developmental editor. But it's only in recent years, I have a short story collection that I've been working on that blends literary and speculative themes. So it's only recently that it's come back into my focus, my own creative focus. But as an editor, as a publishing professional, creating an anthology, in tribute to my favorite author, period, I think the work of Le Guin so perfectly blends literary and speculative as genres. It just made sense to do. And I guess that's part of how this has all come back around in my story.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the influence of Le Guin on your work. You spoke about how your mother introduced you very early to Ursula's work. What, when you were able to sort of start reading it for yourself, what was it that excited you about her work? And I imagine that Ursi has a particular kind of emotional resonance for you, but are there other works of hers that you're particularly drawn to?
I was initially really drawn to the Earthsea books, the way I think many, young writers are, because she has this gorgeous, intricate magic system based on language itself, right? And that conceit so perfectly reflects, how we feel about language. And it reflects just some basic truths about how language operates in the world. Language does cause things to happen. It causes things to materialize. It causes people to take action. And there is magic in words. It shifts culture. So I think it was initially that drew me to those books. But when I moved to Portland in 2009, the city is home to so many literary luminaries, so many famous names. But when I moved there, I found that none of those names loomed larger than Le Guin's. And it was something about her feminism, her pacifism, her commitment to ecological ideals, her pioneering of what we might now think of as queer sensibilities or non-binary, sensibilities. Nobody seemed to, and her commitment to anarchist thought as well. No one seemed to more exemplify the spirit of the city than Le Guin. So I thought, maybe this is time like I should dig into more of her work, because I told you that I discovered the Earthsea books at the time when I had discovered so many other, absolutely fantastic speculative writers, and particularly writers of fantasy. But I had never read any of her science fiction, even though that I knew that she was famous for it. So I started with The Left Hand of Darkness, absolutely blown away. Then I moved on to The Dispossessed, and from there, both those books were so overwhelmingly affecting on a moral, emotional, intellectual level, that I thought, the rest of her work can't possibly be this good, can it? Because the lady was prolific. I really started working my way through it and found that it really was. I think pound for pound and book for book, there's no writer more consistently fantastic. And as you read through her novels, especially if you are a literary geek, like me, you begin to see some patterns. And first, you notice what you feel as a reader. And what I noticed as a reader was that in every single one of her novels, there was a scene that I would stop and reread, sometimes more than once. And almost always, either that scene or in another place of the novel, that would actually make me cry. And so as a writer, as a literary professional, I had to ask myself, why? How? What is she doing? How is she doing this? And we could spend an hour just talking about that, but the short answer is deep character. Deep character. In terms of, not like the way writers are so often like, do you know what your character had for breakfast today? And do you know the names of all their siblings and their favorite colors? Like, not incidental backstory, but backstory in a very focused line. Backstory in a line that shows us where this character is from, often in the process revealing the entire culture that they arose from. And backstory in a line that points straight to a moment of truth or change, where that protagonist is forced to reconsider or something that they've been taught, or to pull from deep within themselves some truth beyond their conditioning or programming, usually in the course of something like a culture clash, you know. And there are other themes as well, but to me, that was the thing that taught me how backstory can create like just a towering sense of emotion at a moment of significant change. You feel so much for these protagonists, and you know they have to move, they have to change, they have to see something differently.
Yeah, I think I wonder whether that comes from like the sort of the anthropological sensibility that she brings to all of her work, which is this kind of sense that the character, as you said, is deeply immersed in a world, and you can see them sort of grappling with all these different pulls and pushes from their culture when they are confronted in these kinds of moments of cultural crisis or conflict. All of that has to come to bear, and that becomes very, it's very there's a kind of as Kundera would say, the unbearable lightness of all of that just coming together in a way is very exciting to watch. um, I wonder, you were talking about how you started reading into her science fiction. um, Sometimes when students ask me, for instance, if I could recommend them something to get into Ursula, I've often, I told them Left Hand of Darkness often, but I found that the word for world is forest sometimes is a real nice sort of entryway for a lot of students into the kind of science fiction worlds that she builds. Is there something that you recommend to people from her work, her fantasy and science fiction work, that you would recommend to someone to sort of understand the initial steps into Le Guin's work?
You know, yeah, as far as like an easy entry, it's hard to beat Left Hand of Darkness just because it's so simple, in terms of its plot, but that plot holds so much complexity. Um, but, in terms of a shorter work, um, I would say The Eye of the Heron. Do you know this book?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite ones. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah. It exemplifies exactly what, I was just talking about. And I think, it's quite a slim masterpiece. I think it's probably 200 pages or less. And, in it, it's set on a planet inhabited by two cultures that were basically exiled there by their planet of origin. And one group really holds themselves, they're very patriarchal, hierarchical, hierarchical society, a very proud, I guess I would say capitalist too. They're very proud of their possessions. And the other group, they view the other group as a very much inferior, very much lesser. They don't have the material culture. They're poorer. They decide things by consensus. They don't have real leaders, and the whole story is told through the eyes of a child of privilege, a daughter of privilege, from the first group. But what we begin to see, and you kind of have the sense like it's sort of like the Pinochet family, like it's like the repressive South American regime, that's slaughtered, a generation. That's who the people in the patriarchal group kind of are. That's why they were exiled. The people in the second group, we get that they were rebels, they're people of peace, they're pacifists. And I think telling the story through the eyes of the daughter of privilege is such a potent narrative choice, because as a woman in that society, a woman of privilege in that society, as in this one, she has certain privileges. She has certain powers, but at the same time, she also is being oppressed, within her own family group, within her own culture. And it's about her turning of mind, her turning of heart to begin to understand that this other group of people they do not see themselves the way her people see them. They do not see themselves as serving her people. They do not see themselves as wanting what her people have. And in the end, when it comes down to really a clash between a violent society and a fundamentally nonviolent one, there's so much in this story that shows us how pacifism can win against violence. And I think at the heart of it, kind of showing us that power is an agreement. Power, like, you cannot have power over somebody who does not agree that you have power over them, and that there are different types of power, and if you have to expend a horrific amount of force in order to use the power that you have at expense to yourself, it may not be as powerful as you think it is. So I guess that's a long way of introducing my easy read pick.
No, I think that you touched on some of you're right. It's a not a very lengthy book, but as you pointed out, there are some themes that I think are really very rich and sort of echo through a lot of her other work. I mean, part of also what I think is in that work is the revolutionary act of walking away.
Yes.
Right. And so I think that, which is another thing that you find in a lot of her work, as a kind of way of resistance to oppression and power over, which is really well exhibited, I think, in The Eye of the Heron. Yeah, a great one. Well, this brings up this question that of an interesting experiment you tried in 2019, 2020, where you essentially spent the year reading all of Ursula's novels. So I'm wondering, like, what motivated you to do this? Why did you decide to make this project for yourself that year? And when you were doing this work, did you find yourself stopping in any of her novels in particular and really pondering over them?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I was preparing to release an anthology in tribute to Le Guin. So I knew that I would be talking a lot about her work. And in some cases, it had been many years since I had read those books. And in some cases, there were novels of hers that I had not read. I don't have the exact count, but I mean, she wrote over 30. And that's not even counting the short story collections and all that. So I wanted to fill in some gaps. I wanted to refresh my memory. And I knew too that I wanted to write about her work. I was preparing myself to write literary essays about her work in conjunction with the release of this anthology I had edited in tribute to her. But the other answer to that question is the lockdown, of the pandemic. And there was very little that we could go out and do in the social sphere. So reading has been my lifeline in times of travail. And that has been consistent across my life. So in some ways, fiction can be an escape. It allows you to live another life. It allows you to travel when you cannot travel. It allows you to immerse yourself in other people's problems when, you don't want to deal with your own. it's also a form of time travel. You can remind yourself of the big events of past times, that we lived through those, that we can probably live through these as well. But also, even as her work offers a sort of escape, as all great fiction does, from the pressures of this world, I really could feel that in her work lay moral courage for dealing with the pressures of our day. This was also the time where Black Lives Matter and the rising movement for racial justice worldwide stepping into the fore, and her work gives us an atlas of how to live through such times, and to do so in ways that we can later maybe hopefully be proud of. So as I worked my way through her bibliography in the course of my year of Le Guin, some of the real highlights for me, really just an incredible peak of that experience. Well, there are two, but Always Coming Home. Always Coming Home, she referred to it as one of her most important and most overlooked books, and I would have to agree with that. Anyone who cares about the future of human civilization, shifting the consumerist, settler, colonialist, exploitive model at the heart of Western culture. I mean, this book goes to the root, I think.
Well, what's interesting about it, so I want to stop you about this. Is it really? We had a conversation here on the program, I think about a year or so ago, with Stanley Robinson, and asked him about his appreciation of Ursula's utopian works, and pointed out that Always Coming Home was her favorite, and he admitted that he did not like it.
Yeah.
Because he felt unlike what you were just saying, that he felt that as an atlas of thinking about the future, it was blurry and mixed, and he didn't feel that it cohered in a way to really provide us with a kind of vision of a possible future that he thinks we really need at this time. So it was a really interesting kind of conversation in that sense. Robinson is one of Ursula's big students, and he just didn't feel that was the masterpiece that she thought it was.
Kim Stanley Robinson is really brilliant at building out the pathway from here to there. And he's very meticulous about the pathways that he builds. She did not reveal the path from here to there at all. But to me, what that book is a feeling portrait. It is like hearing a sound you don't yet know how to make. It's not singing lessons. It is the tone itself. Now you have to figure out how to make that with your voice or whatever equipment you can come up with. But that is the sound. That is the feeling. That is what living in that culture feels like. And to me, it shows the distance between where we are now and what an actual equitable, sustainable culture, how, not just on the level of its material culture, not just on the level of its technology, but in every regard, the way the image of the universe is built into the culture of the cash at every single level. the image of the spiral, the double spiral, the picture of the Milky Way, and what it means to have an image like that, a microcosm of the whole, built into your culture at every level, so you can never forget, the basic truths held in that form. This is just one piece of, what she built that I'm sharing, is the way that symbol operates in the culture of the Kesh. It's the way their villages are built. It's the way their instruments are made. It's the way that they greet each other, and associated with that symbol are the basic truths, of that culture, about something always changing, but always returning to itself. That it's an idea about time. It's an idea about people. It's an idea about everything, and in just that piece, that, for instance, she gives us a blueprint for how to culture, for how to build something where there's a sacred image that holds multitudes within it, and it's built into the culture at every level so that it can't be forgotten.
Yeah,
She
thank
doesn't
you.
tell us how to develop that culture.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. Is that Robinson? I think part of it, in our discussion with him, he was talking about the sense of urgency, given climate catastrophe, that we really need that path, and he found it lacking in that way for him. But I think you're right that there's something about thinking holistically about how to integrate culture, personal life, lived environment, and appreciation of sort of embeddedness in the cosmos that is really also important for thinking about social transformation and change. I think that, well, so this makes me think, in some of your reflection about your year of Le Guin, you've written something. I want to quote you. So you've written, quote, "The older I get, though, the more I see that every problem we have in our culture, from climate change to racism to sexism to poverty, is all because of a, quote, bad story we believe, a story that may have served us at one time but no longer does. It's time for those stories to change," close quote. This reminds me, of course, of the famous sort of National Book Award speech that Ursula gave about the need in the future for brave, courageous authors to help give us these kinds of imaginative futures, to help us navigate through the difficulties that we as humanity are going to face in the next few decades. So I wonder whether you've spoken a little bit about how Always Coming Home impacted you in thinking about how to do imaginative work in this kind of way for social transformation. Do you think that you derived any other sort of lessons from your deep dive into Le Guin's work that can help you think about, what are the kinds of skills, what are the kinds of tones, as you put it, that we need to imagine alternative worlds and futures in response to the kinds of problems that we're going to face? Do you think that there are kinds of sources of joy or inspiration in her work that you think we need to really pay attention to in order to sustain our hope and to move ahead in action? So, I really appreciate the way that you talk about Always Coming Home. I wonder whether there were other things that you found that you thought were useful in that similar kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, so many things that it's hard to even know where to start. But I think one of the things that Always Coming Home showed me is how genuinely difficult it is to imagine something actually outside, really far outside, our culture, for me. Um, she helped to build an imaginative bridge outside of Western culture by drawing upon Indigenous thinking and Indigenous cultures. And that really hit home to me, that you don't have to reinvent the wheel to get outside of the thing that's killing us. Indigenous people are still here. Their cultures are still here. The way to live sustainably, the culture you need to have, the mores, the values, etc., to get outside this thing that's killing us, it already exists. It has always existed. It still exists. So number one, that book turned my mind towards tuning in Indigenous voices in this critical time, and to disbelieving the lie of the I grew up in the Midwest, the image of the noble savage, or like the Indian on his horse, or the last stand, that's what an Indian is, that's what a Native person is this defeated noble person in the past. Indigenous people are not defeated, and they are not in the past. And they have held their culture against all odds, and they carry it still now. Like, in just a few words of Potawatomi, which we all have learned so much from braiding sweetgrass, Robin, I'm forgetting her last name, Kimmer. In just one word of Potawatomi is something that can get you free from one way that you are being held captive by this culture and the way that you were raised, by our language and the limits of the language you were raised with, So that's a really strong thing that I feel that Always Coming Home has led me to, is to tuning in those Indigenous voices, really paying attention to the roads that they lead us on, and to what they can help us imagine. But to think of another imaginative bridge, so to speak, the kind of new stories that we need. There's a YA fantasy series that, as far as I can tell, I've never met another person who's read all three of these books, who is as big of a fan of them as I am. But Voices, Gifts, and Powers, I think, are an extraordinary series. And the book in particular, and they have very cheesy YA covers, which I think is why people don't take them seriously. But, Le Guin wrote Le Guin books, and then people decided what genre they were going to be. The book in particular, Voices, just like The Eye of the Heron, I think gives us a convincing portrait, and that is a path, in a way, of a peaceful people oppressed by a violent empire, succeeding in their revolution without violence. And that is not a thing that the culture I grew up in has given me any imaginative tools to be able to visualize how that might happen. My people on my dad's side are from the Caribbean, and we saw in Haiti, we saw in like all these revolutions, throwing off the colonial, the European colonial government. So often you take over the master's house and you wind up living in the master's house, and you wind up acting like the master. That's not true in all places, but we have seen it. We've seen it all over the world. We have not really had many models for what it is to not only get rid of the oppressor, but to change the system of oppression. And I think that book offers a blueprint for that as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So thank you for that. I appreciate that very much. That's a series of books that I have not yet had a chance to. I just purchased one the other day, as a matter of fact, to start taking a look at. But I think you're right. I think that kind of question about um, what comes after the revolution is something that Ursula hints at very many different kinds of ways,
Mhm.
and I appreciate that very much. Your kind of sense of thinking about, right, sort of thinking about in the title, always coming home. What are the sources for building a really sustainable world? Um, Even though Ursula often talks about the walking away from sources of oppression, as someone told me once, you notice that folks tend to always come back home. So if you think of Shevek leaving Anarres, he returns back to work on it, and that kind of work coming back to home to try to transform is seems to be also an important kind of thread. The importance of thinking about how to come back home once you are transformed and what
Mhm.
that means. Well, us talk a little bit about the work that you have out now, Dispatches from Anarres, this tribute collection. Um, why were you inspired to gather authors together to do honor to Ursula? And in thinking about putting this collection together, what did you hope that it would do?
You know, Le Guin is my favorite author, and I found have found that her essays are just as powerful as her fiction. And I believe it is in an essay in A Wave in the Mind, where she says that, I will see if I can get the quote exactly right. The exception, omission, and denigration the female writer faces during her lifetime are only preparations for her erasure after her death. And to me, when I read that, it just raised the hair on the back of my neck, because it speaks so clearly to the ways there is the fight that the female writer has to get published in the first place, right? Especially if she's saying something different than has been said before, that doesn't quite fit the model set by patriarchal precedent, right? Then there is the fight for the recognition, for the awards, for the prizes, and that's an uphill battle as well, right? But then, even after someone, a woman of great genius has won all those battles, after she dies, is she part of the canon? And if she's part of the canon, does she stay there? Are scholars still writing about her work? Are people still assigning it in college classrooms? Are people still reading it for pleasure? Is it still making the lists of best evers? There are ways at every stage of this process that female geniuses, frankly, are erased or kept from fulfilling, their full potential, or their full potential for impact. So when she passed, I basically said, I'll be damned if I let that happen to her. And who am I to say that? I don't I don't have much power, but the power that I have, I'm going to use. And if there's one thing I've learned from her, it's that, you know. And so I had lived in Portland for 7 years. I knew the impact that she had on the work of so many of the writers that I knew. Portland was her hometown. She lived there for almost 50 years. And I thought, I think I can pull together an anthology in tribute to Le Guin. And in so doing, I really thought that I wanted stories to reflect all the diverse facets of her work, which are numerous, you know. So I was really pleased at the way the anthology came together in a way that I think basically does that. You know, there were a few maybe threads that I felt, well, we didn't quite, you know, pull that through really clearly, or we didn't quite, you know, get something that absolutely nailed that. But they're very few. And in some cases, that was because I wrote directly to writer friends and authors I loved and said, hey, you've got this vein in your work. Do you think you could write something for me, you know, for this project that speaks to that? And just last night, we had a virtual bookstore event that reminded me I did that with the author Michelle Ruiz Kyle, because she has a cat who is a very important character in her first novel, All of Us with Wings. And, you know, Le Guin wrote the Cat Wings books, and her cat had blog posts, like she was a cat person. And so I wrote to Michelle and said, hey, do you think you could write, you know, something about cats, something magical about cats? And apparently this is like one of the only works of short fiction she has ever created. But yeah, she said, yes, let me. And I found out just last night that she had read all the Cat Wings books to her kids. So that was a really special connection.
Yeah. When I was reading through this, my challenge to myself was to try to figure out like what the echo was in Ursula's work for each of these stories, and I was like, oh, that's the Lathe of Heaven right there, and that's this, and so it was really rich to sort of see just the kinds of the sort of playful nature of so many of these stories, but then so many of them end with these kinds of uh, emotionally kind of heavy moments that sort of bring you back to that kind of ethical speculation that Ursula was so good at. So I thought that the collection did a really excellent job in doing that kind of work. So I appreciate that sense that you were hoping that this would be sort of a brick or a support for the monument of Ursula through time.
Absolutely. That is a great way to put it, a brick, you know. And I'm so happy to hear about your experience of reading the anthology, because, you know, I was an obsessive mixtape maker back in the days when we really did make mixtapes and not just playlists. And this anthology is my favorite mixtape ever. But I wanted that quality. I wanted it just to be a fabulous ride in short fiction for anyone who, you know, whether they knew Le Guin's work or not. But I also wanted there to be lots of Easter eggs, lots of layers, you know, lots of other levels the anthology would be speaking on to people who really knew her work. So I'm really glad to hear that. Sounds like
Yeah,
I succeeded in
I like
that
the way you
regard.
put that, the kind of question about Easter eggs, because that's what I was after a while I sort of started looking for that in a kind of way
Mhm.
because I noticed that. So that's wonderful. Um, so I know that you're now doing a lot of these events, trying to share the anthology with lots of different people and speaking with many of the different authors. Um, do you do you have any other projects in terms of thinking about continuing on with the legacy of Ursula now on from this anthology? Are you continuing this sort of memorial project in any kind of way?
You know, I'm not in any explicit way other than continuing to write about Le Guin via essays. But I do have a collection of short fiction of my own called Dream Studies. And in the next year, hopefully, I have a novel that I need to finish and get out into the world. But the project after that is this collection of short fiction. I'd say it's all drafted. Some of the stories are in a second or third draft. Some of them are still very, very firsty. But they all have speculative elements, and they all touch on the issues that keep me up at night. They touch on climate change, sexism, racism, homophobia, and in lots of ways, I feel like it has been my deep focus on her work that led me to create a collection like that, where it wasn't just like, George Saunders talks about your values and ideals being like shy animals that you have to pretend like you're not interested in them, so they'll come out of the woods and grace, show up in your stories. He does that very beautifully. Le Guin did not do that. She did not mince about it. She centered her work on moral questions. She centered her work on the issues that clearly kept her up at night. And I feel like, yeah, this collection of short stories is my version of that.
Well, that's. I guess I want to sort of end with that in our conversation today, and thinking about, you've spent a lifetime really working with Ursula as an inspiration, and something that you tried to sort of pay forward now with your work. I know authors often have this kind of hate this kind of question about their own work, but do you think that there are ways in which your own writing has been affected by Ursula's work? Either you mentioned a little bit in terms of like the way in which you project your writing to be in response to big moral problems and questions and crises. That's something obviously that's part of Ursula's work. But do you think that you've taken lessons from Ursula about how to be a writer and what the responsibility of the writer ought to be?
I feel like the way that I center all my work on so-called political issues or social issues is that's just who I am. And it's part of why Le Guin's work speaks to me so much. I can't really say if it's like a chicken or egg thing. I've been reading her work since I was a kid. Was I drawn to it because that's who I am? Am I who I am because I read that work? I don't know. But in terms of craft, in terms of actual craft, I feel as if, especially the level of focus I put on her work following grad school after I did my MFA, during the course of my MFA, I felt a lot like nobody could give me straight answers on very straightforward questions that I had about craft, about how to write fiction, how to write a novel, period. People use terms like, oh, maybe this story hasn't found its aboutness yet, or is there some sort of change by the end? It was a little like Zen koans or whatever. And I understand now why my mentors responded that way. They responded that way because the novel is novel. It is always being reinvented. Literary fiction is absolutely a place where new approaches are being forged all the time. And those teachers and mentors didn't want to limit the possible, But what I've discovered since is that there are answers to these questions of craft if we know what our values are, if we can agree what our values are. And that's what my class Story Medicine on Teachable is all about. There are, if you know what your values and ideals are in terms of the effect you want to have, in terms of the benefit you want to have to your culture and society, in terms of the way you want to speak to and interrogate bad stories, then there are answers to these questions of craft. And one of them I derive directly from Le Guin. And that is that same thing I was talking to you about earlier, about this deep backstory that leads to a powerful moment of emotion and catharsis around the climax point at the moment of truth. That is something I have taken to heart, and will focus on in all my work moving forward. And in my first book, Hot Season, there's a lot of focus on character, but not quite in that way. I hope it's entertaining to read. I hope it helps to carry some of the real history about how the United States has targeted its environmental activists in the wake of 9/11. I hope it helps to carry real moral questions about how we choose to engage with change making and resisting the exploitation and destruction of the earth. But that book is not set up in such a way that it creates that kind of emotion. The book that I'm working on now is, and that is directly because of what I learned from Le Guin.
That's fascinating. Well, I'm really excited to hear this, and so I look forward to being able to have a bit more experience with your work in that regard. Well, Susan, I want to respect your time and thank you for speaking with us and giving us a little bit of insight into the making of your work and your deep admiration and your love relationship with Le Guin for after all these years. Your book, Dispatches from Anarres, is out now. It's a wonderful collection. I really recommend it. And I appreciate you spending some time to sort of really unpack the ways in which Le Guin can help us to sort of think about the radical imagination for social transformation. So thank you once again.
Thank you so much for having me.